Well, hello you guys. So today we're just going to do a quick video over the turning points. So the package that you received will be for today and tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll do the rest of the lecture, but today you're going to need a highlighter and we're going to point out some of the turning points in the war. Now we're not going to go in detail in these particular turning points because a lot of them you're going to cover next year when you take U.S. history. So we're going to look at our turning points on the Eastern Front in Africa and on the Western Front, and then we're also going to have some additional dates that we need to note. So looking here at the turning point on the Eastern Front, you'll notice that I have Eastern Front, turning point on the Eastern Front right here highlighted, and then I have highlighted Stalingrad. So we had looked at with the invasion of Russia started in June, so it was during warm weather. But now we're looking at December 1942. And so we know that Russian winter and then the soldiers are definitely going to continue to fight is really going to break down the Nazi military. So Stalingrad was the first Nazi defeat on land. We know that Battle of Britain was an area that Germany could not invade. So that was a defeat as well, which set them open for another front. But Stalingrad was their first land defeat, and even there were Nazi soldiers who surrendered. And you'll see in the World War II from space video that they pretty much paraded them in the streets to like, look, they are human, they caved, they gave up. So now, with the defeat at Stalingrad, we are going to see that the plan that the Allied forces would end up meeting in Berlin, it's going to start as Soviets a 2.5-year campaign of starting to push the Germans back to Berlin, and eventually they will meet the other allies in Berlin. So our turning point in Africa, and Desert Fox Rommel had done, for the Germans, a great job down in Africa, but El Alamein will be the point where the British will actually start to drive the Germans out of Egypt. And we know how the British are regarding Egypt and the Suez Canal, where they're going to protect that as much as possible. Germany does eventually get defeated and suffer high casualties and eventually surrender. But the fight in Africa was a tough one. And for the United States, that was really our first experience in Africa, was fighting German soldiers. And it was not pretty for the U.S. soldiers in that area. But it was an experience that they definitely needed to happen, because we had kids who had just graduated high school and had signed up to be in the Army, in the Air Force, and that they were not prepared for what they were going to have to experience in this war. Another turning point will be on the Western Front, and that's going to be D-Day. So we had talked about where they were trying to get access to pictures along the coast of France. They were getting people to share, information. Well, eventually they have decided where that spot's going to be for that invasion, and this will be the invasion of Normandy. D-Day, also Operation Overlord, happened on June 6, 1944. The date is starred, so you also need to star that date, highlight that date, just like my things that are highlighted, you need to have that highlighted too. This was, when you look at D-Day, this was something that was a surprise that for many, that we were successful in gaining ground here, especially when you look at the World War II from space video and see the magnitude of the military setup that Germany had established on those beach fronts. The Western Front was established, so now we have a foothold in France, and so this, within a month, we have freed Paris, and then this starts that move of pushing Nazi Germany back toward Germany. So that agreement that we would meet the Soviet Union in Berlin can now be that focus. Now, with establishing D-Day and having that turn in the Western Front in our favor, Hitler will end up having to fight on 3 fronts. He's going to be fighting the Russians in the east. You've got the area where once we had gained that ground, where the Allies had gained that ground in El Alamein in northern Africa, and then heading into Italy, Sicily, and then Italy. So now they're fighting down within Italy and then also here in the west. The Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944 will be Hitler's last offensive to drive the Allies away from the Western German border. It is not going to be a success. And then so that allowed us to quickly get deep into Germany and be able to meet the Soviet Union in Berlin. Our next date is VE Day, Victory in Europe, May 8th, 1945, and this is when Germany surrenders. So May 8th, 1945 is when the war ends in Europe. But remember, World War II is a war that's being fought in two theaters, in Europe and in the Pacific. So now that we have that victory in Europe and Germany has surrendered, now the Allied forces will have to focus on what's going to happen within the Pacific. Tomorrow, we will start to go through the various conferences that the big three, that Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, they will hold the meetings where they actually make the decisions of what's going to happen after each of these events. And they will also discuss, when it's a surrender, it is unconditional surrender. There is absolutely no negotiation from the other side. It is what the Allies want, and that's the way it's going to be. So when we look at the victory in the Pacific, as the Japanese retreat, the Allies will close in on Japan, and we've seen this so far that after the Battle of Midway, how the tides had really turned in our favor because we had regained naval superiority in the Pacific at Midway. Well, now we're moving, toward Japan, and we're pushing the Japanese back toward Japan. After heavy fighting, we're within 500 miles of Japan. We will talk about the decision on whether or not to drop the atomic bomb. By this point, and President Roosevelt had actually passed away before we even got to May 8th, 1945. And now we have President Truman, who was his vice president, will have to make that call. He will have to decide. Not everyone knew that we had the atomic weapon. We have experienced in the Pacific that the Japanese soldiers and civilians are going to do everything in their power to fight the enemy, that they will even be willing to commit suicide themselves and take Allied soldiers with them. So how many of our soldiers are we willing to sacrifice if we do a land invasion of Japan? We know that it's going to be a bloodbath if we do. And President Truman has to make this decision. Do we send our soldiers in, and then I have to answer for the number of body bags that have to come home, and then the people find out that I actually had a weapon that could have ended this war? And he will make the decision that he is going to use this weapon. And we will talk about what happens when he actually shares with Great Britain and the Soviet Union that we have the atomic weapon, because Stalin is going to be furious. But we will drop 2 atomic weapons August 6, 1945 on Hiroshima, or some people say Hiroshima, and then on August 9th, 1945 on Nagasaki. The fact that we dropped 2 does become a huge issue for the Soviet Union, because our president and Stalin had a conversation about the timeline of the Soviet troops coming in to assist us against Japan. And with that timeline of moving their troops into that region, that fell around the same time as the dropping of our first bomb. Stalin also felt that it should have been a conversation and a decision that they all made and not just our president. But Truman was very clear that this is a U.S. weapon, and the U.S. president will make that call. When you look at the idea of it has to be unconditional surrender, Japan and that timeline. Some have questioned, should there have been given more time after the dropping of the first bomb before the second bomb? And you'll notice that those dates are starred and highlighted. So those are additional dates that you'll need to know along with what had happened. We finally get an unconditional surrender, and that was a huge one for Japan because the question is what would happen with their emperor, and they were willing to protect their emperor at all costs. So our last date that we need is VJ Day, Victory over Japan, on August 14th, and I do have the 15th here in parentheses because it really depends on which time zone you're looking at. The 14th there or the 15th here in the United States, I don't care which one you use, but it does need to be August 14th or August 15th of 1945. Now, this is when they surrender. This is not the date when they actually sign the treaty, but this is Japanese surrender. And then eventually we will have like the treaty that the war is officially over a month later. But for VJ Day, you need August 14th or 15th, 1945. Okay, so what I'll need for you guys to do is once you wrap this up, I also need to make sure that whatever picture you sent of your 17.5 terms and questions that you uploaded onto Schoology today, that it was a clear picture that I can clearly see your work and I'm not playing a guessing game. All right, so tomorrow we're going to finish your notes packet for 17.5 and we're going to go through all of those conferences and also touch back onto this page because it's at those conferences that they were actually making some of these decisions. All right, you guys, have a good day. Go ahead and continue to review for our World War II test, which is scheduled on Monday. And if you are missing any work at the start of class on Monday, is the last time I'm accepting it for this unit. All right, bye.